What we got here is failure to communicate, a chronic neglect of military mental health care. This is Psychiatric Casualties, how and why the military ignores the full cost of war.
Well, greetings, everyone. This is Psychiatric Casualties with one of your hosts, Mark Russell, along with...
I'm Charles Figley, and Kat?
Kathy Regan Figley. The one who keeps showing up whether you want me or not.
Oh, we want you. That's already been settled. Well, so this will be the last two episodes that we'll be taping together for this podcast. I'll be stepping out after this. And Kathy, you had asked me earlier, like, when did this start, kind of writing and talking about it. And I thought about it more, and I says, well, I started writing about this when I was on active duty, right during the invasion, leading up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And then started sending memoranda and point paper up to headquarters, etc. But then Charles and I started, when he was invited to write a book chapter, I believe, Charles, on EMDR in the military. And then I think Howard Lipke was involved with that. And Howard knew me and thought that, that'd be nice to have somebody who's on active duty with the military involved with the EMDR. So you invited me to collaborate with you on that chapter. And that was in 2010, 2011 when we started that.
And not too far after that, we started writing together and publishing quite a few articles, really.
Yeah.
And across all of that, you also participated in the documentary Stranger at Home. And published this book.
Well, you're right. Yes. There was
quite a journey.
It was quite a journey. And I think I have been speaking about it, as I said, since 2003 and writing about it and then participating, as you mentioned, with documentary films and then this podcast, etc. So I think I've kind of got to the point where I'm ready to step aside and let others talk and carry the torch. And I feel real good about that, Charles, because of our writing. We published several books together and book chapters, but on this topic of psychiatric casualties in particular, that there's something now that at least it's in writing. No one can ignore that these things have happened. The cycles of preventable wartime crises, and what are the psychiatric lessons of war, and how we've neglected those, and what needs to be done to prevent future crises of this sort, these self-inflicted crises. So anyways, a little bittersweet, but I do feel pretty good place that this would be a good place to step off. And as I said, let others carry the mantle.
And Kat, you've been involved from the beginning in many ways. You've heard me bitching about the way, the treatment within the military and just the crazy, unbelievable stories that Mark primarily has uncovered and that we've incorporated within the book. So here we are at the last chapter, and kind of amazing. And the wonderful thing about it, though, I came from, grants and contracts and publications, etc., but not really the nitty gritty that you were able to get into, that you were able to access, that you were aware of. I mean, it's almost magical in terms of the importance of it and how the stories, there's so many stories in terms of the struggles, not only you, and I would say you in particular, of course, but others that don't have a voice, that don't have the motivation because they're too angry, too confused, frustrated. Those are unfortunately, the aftermath of all of these terrible procedures and processes that the military has imposed on all of us.
Yeah, there's also a good dose of fear out there too, which I can relate to, but for whistleblowers of any type, but if you go against the Department of Defense is a whistleblower, you can rightly expect some reprisal. And that affects not only the service member, but it affects their family. But that's a choice my wife and I made together to speak out while on active duty, not wait until I'm retired and I'm safe, I got my pension and everything, but to try to make a difference while I was on active duty. But it's not without its perils. But,
Yeah.
But
So
overall,
we put you up there with Holmes. Was it Holmes, the guy that we talked about a couple podcasts ago, who was banished from the military for his advocacy of doing the right thing decades ago, maybe 100 years ago? Who am I thinking of?
oh, you're thinking of the Union Army Surgeon
Yeah.
General, right?
Yeah, see, so you're the modern day version, right? Because
No.
you speak up and then you have to suffer the consequences.
Uh-huh.
And that's the part about it that's so wrong. That's the part that's wrong. And what I think about, was you were talking earlier about the time frames and how long this has gone on and the history that you document in this book.
Mm.
I think let's put this book in a time capsule and have someone pull it out in 50 years and see if anything is different then.
Mm.
And what they'll do is they'll just add more chapters.
Unfortunately, you're right.
That's the part. It's like this is an immovable beast, and it's not just bureaucracy.
Yeah.
It's stigma and all the other dark parts that you've talked about over time that come into play, and it just gets bogged down in the wrong places.
Well, I think you hit it on the head, and that's kind of the gist of this last chapter in our book, Charles.
Yeah.
Psychiatric Casualties is talking about how do you transform mental health care.
Mhm.
And the idea is that the military, if it was to ever transform in its views and how it in policies towards mental health care, that would translate to improving the civilian sector as well. Because as the military goes, often so goes society, is a frame that we use. So we basically outline in this chapter, there are three options for us. There's three choice points. How do we go about improving mental health care in this country and in the military in particular, starting with the military? And we're left with three options. The first is what we call the status quo, which is do nothing. Just let things happen as they have, progress, very incremental change. Nothing fundamental, a pattern of neglecting mental health care until the time of a major war breaks out. And then suddenly we're scrambling because there's a mental health crisis, and you have the media, you have family members, you have Congress, congressional members coming down on the military, do something, and they throw money at it, and they create a lot of programs and policies that seem to fix the problem until the war's end. And then we go back to what we call the national reset, which is like a reset of your computer, which is the default setting of neglect, back to neglect, which is kind of where we're at now. We've been in that phase of undoing, unfunding a lot of the mental health programs, initiatives that were started in invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. And then, so that's the status quo, is just sit back, do nothing, try to let the military take the lead and change what they will when they have to, which is always compelled from outside, and just kind of limp along. And of course, millions of people are affected. We have rashes of suicides. We have family members who aren't served, and that is a generational ripple effect that comes from that policy of maintaining the status quo.
Well, and you know what I'm reminded of as you spoke is a civilian incident. If I recall correctly, they called it the Billy Ferry incident. And it's in the Tampa area, if I recall correctly. And this man who had a mental health problem went in and firebombed a grocery store. And so this was so in Florida, and number of casualties and whatever. And that had an impact of influencing mental health policy in a positive direction.
Mm.
Right? Because then they started looking at what were the options in the community and what's going on, blah, blah, blah. And so new mental health policies came into play.
Yeah.
But what's happening now, if you compare now to then, that was an unusual incident that shocked people. Now we have repeated shocking incidents, everything from murder, suicide through to domestic terrorism, and none of it is moving mental health policy. None of it. So you've got military isn't moving, mental health isn't moving, and may even be regressing.
Yeah, most likely regressing. I think in most states, the first thing that's cut from funding when things are, when you're going through a recession or you're going through economic challenging times is those programs for the most needy, right? Those people without voices. And that's often mental health will take the first hit.
And then criminalize the behavior and put people in jail instead of give them mental health treatment.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So, and we have for-profit prisons now. Got to keep those beds filled. Sorry, that's a different trajectory, but it all ties together. Follow the money.
Yeah, often that's the case. And then so the second option for us, if we're those who might be interested in advancing mental health and transforming it, again, our argument is that for any mental health advocate, the best place to start to fix mental health is in the military because it's a captured environment, if you would, right? And you have more control over the policies and implementing those policies. So, but the second option is that we allow Congress and the chief of the armed forces, the executive branch, the president, you let those elected representatives of our government fix the problems of mental health care in the military. And they often do. They get involved when there's a war, a shooting war, and there's a lot of bad press coming out about untreated PTSD or suicide, or incarceration rates are going up, or homelessness goes up. So if something gets into the public psyche through the media usually, and then Congress will get involved, and sometimes the presidents will get involved, and sometimes make very meaningful changes in the military. Yeah, we talked about, for example, quite a bit about President Roosevelt during the Second World War. And his executive order back in 1944 was to make the military accountable and responsible for providing maximum benefit of rehabilitation care for psychiatric casualties before they're discharged back into the private sector. So, and they had a very progressive program that we talked about that was documented in that film, Let There Be Light. And that was all through an executive action. So we've had presidents from time to time who have acted that way, probably no one as bold as Roosevelt before or after, but Congress certainly has stepped up in times of national emergencies and in a very reactive way, not a proactive way. Throw money at mental health problems. New programs are developed, new staff are hired, and we kind of limp along until the war's end, and then that funding tends to dry up. Congressional members rotate, they leave, you get new people in, and then you go right back to the national reset of baseline neglect again. But that's the second option, is to let the elected representatives do their job. And you can kind of see how that has played out. That's one reason why Charles and I wrote this book. Those first two options have not really worked terribly well. But really, that's it. You can maintain the status quo and just shut up and let things be as they have been. You could try to do some political initiatives through, the voting and for electing officials who advocate for mental health, and try to hope that the elected representatives do the right thing when it comes to mental health care. And if that doesn't work, you're left with the third option. What do you think of that second option, Charles? The let Congress and the executive branch manage it.
It's exactly what you say. I mean, during the war, when there's pressure and when bodies counts and there are bodies coming back from the war, et cetera, then everyone at least has some interest and some progress has made, but it all unfolds. I mean, in addition to the things you talked about, where the military members themselves retire.
Yes.
And new come in, and they are not oriented like the existing troops were in terms of the importance of it. And actually, it was starting to fray toward the end of these wars that we've had. And I've seen it myself when I'm interacting with active duty Marines, mostly from reserves, but nonetheless, they're part of that. And it's very frustrating. But the third option,
Yeah.
you and I have talked about and have talked to others about, and our hopes were rising slightly, at least. You want to talk about that, the transformative change by way of class action suits?
Yeah, I mean, it's
How many times did we mention that in the free as, what is the
Ferris Doctrine.
Yes, fair enough. How many times have we talked about that during our travels? I remember our going to Las Vegas, remember? Yeah. And the university had a program, and we, sat down to work on these things. And I think our hopes were rising to the extent that we were meeting with this law firm who seemed to be very open and, positive, etc.
Yes.
But nothing happened.
Nothing happened. I mean, so we've met with a couple of groups. One was the UNLV law group that we talked about, and then we met with a law group up in Seattle too. That a very prestigious law firm. The issue that kept coming up from the lawyers, and they were very sympathetic to the cause, but when it came down to filing a class action lawsuit against the military, was the Ferris Doctrine, which, for those who aren't familiar with that, it was a Supreme Court case that has been interpreted over time that says that active duty and family members of active duty are not able to sue the military, even for things as egregious like wrong site surgery, where they cut off the wrong leg or the wrong limb or the wrong eye, or just the grossest of medical neglect, but that there is no recourse, legal recourse in the military. And that's been the case up until recently, where they have made some slight modifications to the Ferris Doctrine, which allows, in very limited numbers, some lawsuits from either active duty or family members. But it has to be very specific, typically like a wrong site surgery. And it's extraordinarily limited in terms of who can and how you might go about suing the DoD, even with this modification to the Ferris Doctrine. But in no way does it allow mental health to be a target. If somebody committed suicide, there was neglect, or somebody didn't get treatment for PTSD and they end up, in jail or whatever, there is no recourse in the current situation as far as the legal option goes. But as you know, we talked about this before on this podcast, there is a precedent in the UK, United Kingdom, where their equivalency of the DoD, called the Ministry of Defense, or MOD, was sued by active duty and family members that made radical changes to how the British military dealt with mental health care and dealt with stigma. And that change in their law, the British law, that allowed that type of lawsuit is what we're advocating for here in the US, was that US law was based on the British law, common law. So we basically incorporated that in the colonies. And then when we became independent, we've maintained that similar rule of law. And the British used to have a law prevented their soldiers and family members from suing against their family, against their Ministry of Defense. And they woke up and they passed a new law that says, okay, under certain circumstances of neglect, where harm could be proven, that active duty and family members could sue the British military, and did, and were successful. That has yet to happen here in the US.
And I think it's still maintained today, pretty sure. They didn't, when the war was over, they didn't eliminate it.
No, they, as far as I know, that's in the UK, that's standing law and that's precedent. And there have been large class action suits filed against the Ministry of Defense for they're not providing adequate PTSD care, or they're relying on frontline psychiatry, as their primary means of intervention, which end up making things worse. What's interesting in that equivalency of that's the High Court, the equivalency to the Supreme Court ruled on this Ministry of Defense versus PTSD case. And in that case, they had experts' testimony that the frontline psychiatry that we talked about is a 100-year policy started in the First World War, basically sending people back who've emotionally broken down in combat, keep them off the front lines for about 3 or 4 days, 3 hots and a cot, and then send them back to the front lines. That frontline psychiatry policy was decided by the High Court of the UK as being unethical and harmful. But yet that still is the policy in the US military today. It hasn't wavered.
So as you were talking about the class action, understanding that all of the stuff that happened in the UK led to a positive outcome, what I'm thinking about is what happens to people in the US who file a class action? Do they become stigmatized just like they would for having a mental health problem? And does that make their life worse? And what is the level of aversion to rocking the boat when you have, a family and whatever, and it's going to create disruption like you and your wife agreed to? I mean, that was a family decision, and that's a rough road to walk. I'm just wondering your perspective on people willing to do that.
Yeah. Well, that was a very meaningful point you're making, in that when we met with the law group up in Seattle to discuss the class action, they told us that basically they need to find active duty members currently who are willing to put their names, go forward and risk exactly what you're talking about, Kathy, which risk their livelihoods. And yes, the stigma, but also the reprisal that will come from it. And yeah, well, we never got farther than that discussion, trying to identify. I think you probably would find some individuals to do that, but you'd have to have some type of pipeline to know who those people are, to reach out to them and say, hey, we're having this class action, and are you interested in it? So former veterans, former active duty, family members of retirees, etc., would not be, according to the lawyers that we've spoken with, that they would not be eligible for a class action. It had to be active duty. And that creates a whole nother barrier for exactly the reasons you outlined.
So class action is a nice idea, but not a very practical in these days anyway, under this current. It's not something that's going to happen in the near term.
Well, not in the near term, but in the UK situation, that the British Parliament changed the law. It was under the pressure from family members of veterans and veterans themselves that they changed the law. They didn't put the onus on the private in the Marine Corps or the sailor, the enlisted sailor, to say, I'm going to put my hand up and make myself a target by suing the government, be part of this class action. The elected leaders chose to do that. So that was option 2. Right, that we talked about. Option 2 is the elected leaders change the law. They actually overturn Ferris and adopt something similar to what the UK has adopted. It doesn't allow for just going crazy of lawsuits. I mean, you have to have real standing, and there has to be real demonstrable harm and evidence of that. So it wouldn't be like you couldn't sue your commander for sending you to the front lines, because that's part of war. And that was one of the reasons for Ferris, was to protect the military from frivolous lawsuits that would paralyze it from achieving its primary mission, which is to fight and win wars. It's just that Ferris has been interpreted to the extent that meant no lawsuits are possible. and in no situation, and now again, they modified it very slightly to make it still nearly impossible to do that. But yeah, so that is the option, is for our Congress to change the law, or at least modify it to the extent that would allow a situation like the UK, where for service members who have legitimate harm or show legitimate damages, they have some recourse. And not so much to penalize the military, but to change the military's policies. And that's what happened in the UK, that they forced them to change their deployment policies, their screening policies, their treatment policies, and how they dealt with stigma. Not that it's, great and everything's fixed as a result, but it put them on a footing where they had much better outcomes as far as PTSD and suicide than we had in the US during the same conflicts that the British were involved with over in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on.
So 3 options. Here we
Three
have
options. Take your pick.
And which is the likelihood, or which one has the strongest likelihood? It's maintaining the status quo.
Unfortunately.
Well,
That's why we call it the status quo.
yeah. So there has to be, then, in knowing the status quo, some kind of way people can still get what they need. And that's always the challenge when you've got limited resources, you've got stigma, all that other kind of stuff. How do you reach the people who need it to make sure they get what they need to recover from their experience? It's a tough road. First of all, they have to be willing, acknowledge they have a problem and be willing to get it taken care of, then face the stigma of getting it taken care of. I want to find some kind of path that when we wrap this up today, we could say to people, there's something to hold on to, because we can't leave this after 20 years of work with 3 options and the status quo.
I think we've done our best.
Well, you'd think, yeah. The knowing smiles from the men who served in the military. What can you do, right? You have to, when it's the status quo, you fight the status quo as best you can.
Well, I mean, realistically, those are the 3 options.
They are.
I wish there was another, but you know what? When I've done the documentary films, the Thank You for Your Service and then Strangers at Home, did a lot of question and answering from the audience. And they asked a similar question, what can we do?
Right.
Is the status quo. And it's like, well, you can contact your congressperson, right? In other words, option 2, you can contact a news reporter, an investigative reporter, and try to create a media frenzy, and that's usually what gets Congress activated and government activated, is by getting bad publicity or getting people to inquire on it, force them to make answers. But that type of groundswell is really looking at option 2, is trying to get something from the top down that is initiated by people with goodwill who want to do something for mental health and are frustrated by it. And what can they do is that, well, you can do a nonprofit, which is try to fill in the holes. And that's what we've had, tens of thousands of nonprofits spring up with people who are concerned about the status quo and are trying to make a difference and do. And nonprofits have been invaluable, but we've relied on the nonprofits. And unfortunately, the problems, as far as preventing a lot of the problems in the first place, this is what Charles and I wrote this book about, or the nonprofits aren't going to be able to do that, but they are able to fill in when there are holes or gaps in services, as you were describing.
Yeah, and again, the same people are retiring like we are.
Yeah.
People that know it the best, that have studied it, who contributed to the literature, etc.
Yeah.
There's just so much you can do while you're active, and then those folks leave or die or retire, whatever.
They retire. Yeah, a good example of that, someone that I worked with, it was in the first documentary, Thank You for Your Service, was the Vice General of the Army, second highest ranking Army officer, General Pete Corelli, who was an Iraq War veteran himself. And he became a believer, as many do on the active duty side, when they see firsthand what the effects of war stress are on the human body and human mind. And he was a staunch advocate. He wore his uniform and says, we're going to change how we deal with TBI, and we're going to change the stigma. He had put forward policies to change PTSD to PTS, post-traumatic stress, so that it could be less stigmatizing. People would be more willing to answer honestly on these deployment screenings and get help. And he was a big advocate for developing these centers of excellence in the DoD for treating TBI and PTSD, et cetera. So well, I mean, very strong advocate of that, retired, and his influence has progressively waned. Chief Admiral Mike Mullins, another individual who's on the documentary Thank You for Your Service with Me. Chief of the Navy, also became staunch believer, staunch mental health advocate. Retired, new people come in, war's in. So the personalities, our personalities, whoever on active duty, when you retire, you have less influence. And then when you kind of retire as I'm doing after these podcasts, then it requires other voices to pick it up. And so that's unfortunately part of what maintains the status quo, is that you can't depend on personalities to change this problem. It's going to need to be a very active group of people with staying power, right?
But you know what I'm thinking now, after listening to that, thinking again about a family perspective, looking at things from the outside a little bit. So basically, what your book has done and what this podcast has done, it has normalized the experiences of everybody who has gone through these things. So if there is anything at all that I could say to families is, if you've been driven crazy by trying to get services for your loved one, it's a real thing, and your struggle is a real thing. And so then it's, how do you find the support you need? Maybe it's with other spouses, how do you find the support you need when you know that this is real and this is the status quo?
Yeah.
So there, it's like, okay, well, then it's time to do our own research. It's time to, whatever it is, people will turn to within their own communities to find answers, whether, and that could be a chaplain or a minister, and there's a lot of those getting trained in PTSD. So, that's
without doubt.
hope is. This is real. And you have to cope with it.
Yeah.
You mentioned the nonprofits. So,
yes.
There it is.
I mean, as an individual or a family, you have to take care of yourself. You got to put, like the old airline phrase goes, you put on your oxygen mask before you put on help others.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, yeah, you're in survival mode. You got to do what you got to do to help yourself or help your loved ones to get the help they need, right? That's your first priority. But I also think, though, that we need people to contact their congressman to contact the media, or both. It's not one or the other, but to create that groundswell, that political pressure. Because really, option 2 right now is our really only viable option, which is that the U.S. Congress changes the Ferris Doctrine and allows a legal remedy, which is option 3, which is going to keep the military's feet to the fire, and they will change, as we've seen in the UK, their mental health policies. And there's a benefit to society about those changes. So it's not either or, it's both.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, somebody like me who learned about the Ferris Doctrine, is it Ferris, F-E-R-I-S?
F-E-R-E-S.
F-E-R-E-S. Okay. So that's where I need to start my education then.
Yeah.
So that when I write to my congressperson, I know what I'm talking about.
Right.
Now, are there any, like if I were to Google, who's the best person to contact about the Ferris Doctrine and how to change it? Like what kind of lawyer would I look at even, or what kind of, how would I get started?
Well, that's what Charles and I embarked on, was trying to find, we went to Yale, we went to UNLV, we went to Seattle, UW, and
Looking for
trying to find a law firm that was looking to do something pro bono probably, and to be a justice advocate, and not, looking to make a lot of money off of it or anything, but that they were big enough where they could withstand the government pressure or issues that might come up if they're advocating for it. But the Ferris Doctrine, I forget exactly what year. I think it was in late 1940s or early 1950s. Ferris was a private, and I think in the Army. He was in a barracks, and the barracks had been inspected multiple times and shown to have faulty electrical wiring. It was a fire hazard, and it was supposed to be condemned. But the base commander kept that barracks open, and people, there was a fire and people were killed.
Mm.
And Ferris's, I think his family sued the Army, attempted to sue the Army for wrongful death, and had a lock solid case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, well, if we allow this lawsuit to happen, it's going to paralyze the military. And even though they're standing, that you join the active duty, you give up certain basic rights or whatnot. And one of those would be to sue your employer. So that was the Ferris Doctrine. But you can Google it and it'll tell you a heck of a lot more and probably correct me on some of that, what I just rattled off. But we write about it in our book too, about that.
I'm going to look that up.
Yeah, there was another incident, I think right after it was 1946, a year after the Second World War ended, and there was a bomber that was flying, a B-52, I believe, that was flying in New York City in inclement weather, and the bomber smashed into a skyscraper and killed people. And there was a tort action against the military. These people were not in the military who were victims, they were civilians. And they did allow the suit of the military in that case. So that was part of the Supreme Court's deliberation about who could sue and who could in what circumstances. And there was the origins of the Ferris Doctrine.
I always get depressed.
Yeah. Well, our chapter actually starts off pretty optimistic. We list off 24 concrete, specific actions that, if taken, will ensure there would not be another self-inflicted mental health crisis.
Mm-hmm.
For every generation that's gone to a war. And some of them are just basic common sense stuff, like, have enough mental health providers on staff, make sure that they're well trained. Like, Charles, one of the first things, your first involvement with me was right after the invasion of Iraq in 2003 when I was deployed. I did a survey based on my experiences of how many mental health providers in the military, active duty like myself, who wore uniforms, so psychiatrists, psychologists, and active duty social workers, how many have been trained into the new DoD practice guidelines on PTSD that were developed in 2004. But how many were trained to actually assess and treat PTSD with some type of evidence-based treatment? And we found 97% had not been trained out of 100 and I don't know what it was, 111 or so, 113 providers we interviewed. And it was your journal.
Yeah,
traumatology. It was the only traumatology. It was the only journal that would publish my survey. They thought it was a convenient sample and it wasn't a scientific sampling. I talked to everybody I knew and interviewed anybody in mental health in the Air Force, the Army, those who served the Marine Corps and the Navy. But anyway, nobody would publish it. And then I reached out to you. I knew you were a Marine, and I thought, okay, Charles, I hope he doesn't know me, but I hope he says yes. And you did, and graciously. That was the first article that I had published on active duty, talking about a training deficit. Here we are, 2003, 2004, at the beginning of Iraq invasion, and all that happened after that. And we had, most providers had not even been trained at all on the basic things like how to diagnose properly and how to treat.
They still aren't.
Not at the level they should be, for sure.
It's remarkable. Well, we did the paper, one of our last papers together with a former student, I think, of yours, right?
Yeah.
So, get more folks up to speed in terms of being able to work with the military.
Right, that's right.
I was shocked at the at the dismal how hard it is to find good practitioners to work with military veterans. Very sad. But the reason I think the reason well, I know the reason why I did it was it made sense, and this is needed. This is high level of attention to nationally. This is an important findings, important study. But my guess is that there's no all the publications you spoke with, there was no veterans who were part of either editor or even on their editorial board. I mean, it's very, very unusual. And I'm still surprised in all the 3 universities that I've been at, except for one person, actually. No one were veterans. And I'm not criticizing, I guess. Maybe it's not a great place to work. I don't know, within a university, but it says a lot about our country and who does the fighting.
Yeah, well, the 1% that raised their hands and joined the military, you see that even less than 1% in universities and colleges. The university I taught in Antioch University, I taught there for 13 years. I'm pretty sure I was the only veteran, certainly in my department, psychology department.
But you had veterans, though, right, that took your class and that were interested in what you're saying.
Yeah, we had several students that, from Afghanistan, Iraq, during those wars, who came to become psychologists because of their experiences. And that's, again, what gives me hope, is that there is a generation that thinks that mental health stigma is bullshit and needs to be changed. It's antiquated, and our policies of mental health are antiquated. And so it may be the younger generation of providers, the younger generation of journalists, the younger generation of elected leaders or lawyers will band together and hopefully read our book. That there will be so they know what the history is, they know the patterns, they have the references to make the arguments changing.
Let's hope so. I'm not going to say whether I'm optimistic, but we can always hope in that regard. But it just seems like you don't talk about it. I mean, my sense is that there's no discussion, and why? They don't have anything. Nothing is on the line for them. They have no experience in this. Maybe they would get annoyed and frustrated if they did, but
I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the younger generation moves into all of this, because they've gone through experiences that we didn't when we were in grammar school and high school. They are sensitized to trauma in ways that we are not, because of the pandemic and other things. And I wonder how that's going to impact the war mentality. Part of what keeps the military going is war mentality. And, we have to have ways to make sure that people who don't belong in power don't have control and cause harm. I'm just speaking globally and not about anything in particular at the moment. But, we've got it. I hope they're sensitized to the point that we stop hurting each other. But we've gone through things before. 1920s, 1930s went through a lot of stuff, had great time, and then it all went to hell again. So
Yeah, we do go through those cycles, but yeah,
yes.
I think I've seen it in working with young people, both coming out of the military now, when I'm doing my VA disability exams, but also when I was teaching young people, that there's some truth to the fact that generationally there is less tolerance for stigma of mental health and more openness for seeking mental health. And probably for the reasons you stated, Kathy, like the people who've grown up through COVID or the financial crisis and all the mass shootings and things that didn't exist as much when we were in our formative years, but
Mhm.
two major wars, etc. So yeah, we see signs that these, when it comes to individual perspectives of mental health, seem to be changing. What we haven't seen is a collectiveness yet, of that banding together of like-minded individuals. It becomes a political movement,
Mhm.
and zero tolerance for anything other than mental health parity with physical.
Mhm.
But just stepping back from the military, though, I helped create two, I think, major organizations, let's say, or at least sub organizations, and that's the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies.
Yeah.
I ended up being president for 2 years because there was so much infighting about who will be the second one, that we just sort of called it off, and cooling off period, et cetera, et cetera. But also, and I'm especially proud of this, the American Psychological Association and all of the divisions that they have, divisions in terms of clusters of organizations, they essentially identify a division that represent a particular area within psychology. And with psychological trauma, it has been, I think, a real eye opener. And just the other day, I chair the fellows committee 1 year, that's all, that's try to muster those people within the division, within 56, within trauma psychology, because there's a lot of folks that are there that are really pretty much experts in the area of trauma, but they received their fellow status in some other division. So we're trying to sort of pull them all together and get them a fellow within trauma psychology in order to promote and push the organization. But it's been fairly frustrating in terms of the whole mental health issue, because Kathy and I have been very active in terms of the Green Cross as an example. There are others as well.
Yeah.
But to try to clarify that, and also to emphasize that it shouldn't just be part of psychology or even those that provide therapy. But in addition, there should be people who are able to talk about, teach it. Kathy is an example of that. She's taught as many military as anyone who's been in the military, actually, over the years. But you find the fights and you find the incentives where you find them, and sometimes it's not where you expect it to be.
Yeah, or by the organizations you'd expect to be. So yeah, I've been a member of the American Psychological Association since I was a grad school student. And it's been disappointing, to be honest with you. The APA has had an off and on relationship with the military, as you know. A lot of political activists didn't want the APA to be involved in the military at all, especially after the issues with torture that came out of the Iraq experience. But even before that, there has been conflict. But the APA had, at the beginning of the First World War and the Second World War, had been strong advocates to help support the military. So they've had in the past an advocacy for mental health care and to prove it. And I know that's their mission today. What I haven't seen is the APA pick up our book and advocate for it. I don't mean that literally. I mean the causes that are represented in our writings. That seems to be, for a political committee like the APA, a political scientific committee, that seems like something they should be getting behind. It shouldn't be just our. I'm sorry.
There is a military division of APA, right?
There is, right? But Yes.
but they're not doing anything.
No, and nor is the trauma division or any of the other divisions. As far as putting their mouth where their, wherever is, and advocating for changes in the legal system to overturn Ferris or to, get us on track with the UK and how we deal with mental health in the military and stigma, et cetera. But I don't see that. And when I was teaching a doctorate program, and our program became APA accredited, which is a big deal for students and faculty. One of the things that was very disappointing for me as a faculty member was APA accreditation does not require a single class on trauma. They have all kinds of requirements, cultural sensitivity, ethics, all right, mandates, no question about it. But for a psychological association to not require a single class on trauma
Amazing.
is striking. And master's level, there's a K CREP or something like that. That national, they do require specifically classes like on crisis intervention and trauma as part of the accreditation process.
Yeah, that's more in the area of counseling psychology, not just clinical psychology, etc. Yeah, they're very big on that.
Very big on it, but not the American Psychological Association. Go figure.
Yeah, that's pretty big.
So if they're not advocating, that's how we train our future psychologists, then it makes it understandable why they not advocate. They advocate for a lot of things politically, but I've never seen them advocate for fixing mental health care in the military or, as a way to improve it in the private sector.
Tell you, if the disciplines got together between social work, psychology, medicine, etc., the disciplines could really shake the earth. But they need to come together on a common definition of what it is they're advocating for, and that probably is where the rub comes in, because every discipline has their own got to have this.
Yeah,
but it's like that's what would work.
Yeah, I think again you're getting groups of people, like-minded people who are fed up with the status quo and really want to improve the status of mental health care. And there are groups available. It just takes someone or someones to try to unite that into a movement that would put pressure on Congress and or the executive branch to do the right thing, right? Option 2. But hey, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I see we're kind of at the end for our episode today.
Yes, I think so.
Aren't we?
Yeah. All right. Well, how about we wrap this up today, and then we'll finish up next episode, this chapter on transforming military mental health care. Bill, we'll sign off. We'll see you all later.
Okay. Bye-bye.